Welcome to the 27th annual meeting of the Research Bureau. My name is Mike Mulrain, and I'm privileged to be the chair of the board of the Research Bureau. In a few minutes, we'll begin the formal business part of the meeting, but before we do, just want to say a few words and recognize a few individuals and organizations that help the Research Bureau throughout the year. We have various city officials that are either en route or in attendance here. I'm probably going to miss a few folks, but I would like to mention the city officials that will be in attendance. Joseph Petty, Mayor of the City of Worcester. Mike O'Brien, City Manager of Worcester. Connie Lukes, Worcester City Councilor. Bob Moylan, Commissioner of Worcester Parks and Public Works. David Moore, the City Solicitor. Dr. Melinda Boone, Superintendent of Worcester Schools. And Lou Evangelitis, Worcester County Sheriff. Again, thank you, and thank you for all your support. Many of our ideas come from our city officials throughout the year. I'd also like to thank our many sponsors here today. The work of the Research Bureau would not be possible without the generous support of our foundations and our corporate and business sponsors, not only from a financial perspective, but also from the volunteer and time put in by many employees at many companies that have helped both in terms of attending events and also aiding with some of our research. For those, if you look around the room, I think you'll see all the various companies represented that are sponsors here. Would those individuals from these companies just stand up to be recognized, please? I'd also like to give a special thank you to our presenting sponsor, which is Commerce Bank, and our leadership sponsor, which is Polar Beverages of today's event. I'll speak about Polar in a few minutes, but first, Commerce Bank has been a strong supporter of the Research Bureau for many years. Brian Thompson, President and CEO of Commerce Bank, together with many other Commerce representatives that are here today, have been regular supporters at all Research Bureau events. Brian, who serves as Vice President of Finance for the Research Bureau, has been a tremendous spokesman for the agency and its research reports and has worked tirelessly on behalf of the organization. I'd like to thank Brian and Commerce Bank for its generous sponsorship of today's event and ask Brian to say a few words.
Good afternoon. And welcome. Thank you, Mike, for your kind words. Commerce Bank is delighted to again be the presenting sponsor of the 27th annual meeting of the Research Bureau. A special welcome to Mr. Eric Rosengren, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and to other honored guests who are here this afternoon. The Research Bureau is a very important contributor to our region's success, and we congratulate so many of you who have been involved over the years in playing an important part in that success. Commerce Bank, along with other corporate supporters, have been sponsoring a speaker series which provides a forum to learn and discuss the many critical issues which our cities and state are encountering today, whether it be pension reform, downtown revitalization, educational reform, or the many issues surrounding state and local budgets. Each of these forums are led by national leaders who are highly respected in their fields. We plan to continue these forums in the fall and will provide ample notice of the upcoming speakers. If you've attended in the past, I think you recognize the value of the meetings. If you haven't, please join us, and I assure you, you will not be disappointed. We at Commerce Bank and other members of this community provide financial support to the Research Bureau in order to provide a forum for informed debate. Fact-based research developed by the Bureau has allowed our citizens and policymakers to make more informed decisions on matters which are so important to all of us. Over the past 27 years, Dr. Roberta Schaefer and her team have stayed the course, consistently delivering high-quality reports which have become models for other communities to emulate. Thank you, Roberta, and for your team as well. I'd also like to recognize Mike Mulrain, our president, for his leadership of this organization. His ability to bring focus to timely and important issues, along with our staff, have allowed us to complete some very important work. Our two most recent reports were especially informative: benchmarking public safety in Worcester and benchmarking economic development in Worcester. These reports assist the reader in identifying critical issues for debate, and they are available on our website. On behalf of Commerce Bank and its chairman and owner, Duddy Massad, and the sponsors of this year's annual meeting, we welcome the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston President Eric Rosengren and salute the important role that the research has played in making our region a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you again, Commerce Bank, for all your support. Now, we'd like to begin the business part of the meeting. The first order of business is to approve the January 2012 board minutes that are included in your package that you received on the way in. We have a motion from Brian. Do we have a second? Second. All in favor? Any opposed? Thank you very much. The next order of business is our nomination committee report. I'd like to ask Sandy Dunn, past chair of the board and current chair of the nominations committee, to present the nomination committee report.
Thanks. Thank you, and welcome to a truly wonderful and diverse gathering of corporate, political, and academic leadership throughout central Massachusetts. Please bear with us while we do our business piece. We do have slides, which is going to help us get through this. If you'll turn your attention to the screens, we're going to save a bit of time and then call for some votes. The executive committee shown here on the slide remains the same, with the exception of Bruce Galtney of the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, who's completing his term of service. Please join me in a round of applause in thanking Bruce. He will be remaining on our board. Anthony Consigli with Consigli Construction is nominated to serve a 3-year term on the executive committee. And in addition, Brian Buckley, Patrick Hughes, and Fred Mulligan have also been nominated to serve an additional 3-year term. May I have a motion to accept these nominations? Thank you. Second? All in favor? Opposed? Thank you. On the next slide, I'd like to draw your attention first to the individuals at the lower portion of this slide: Lawrence Adams, Kevin Condren, Andy Davis, Neil McDonough, John O'Brien, and David Woodbury have done an outstanding job serving on our board for many years, and we'd like to thank them with a round of applause for their At the top of the slide, we have individuals that are being nominated for an initial 3-year term, and they include Peter Alden with Bay State Savings Bank, Craig Blaze with the Worcester Business Development Corp., Barry Maloney of Worcester State University, Francesca Maltese, Danielle O'Connor and Sons, Kate McAvoy-Zonzik, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, John Merrill with Fidelity Bank, and Richard Powell with Greenberg, Rosenblatt, Cull, and Pizzoli. In addition to that, we have a long list of individuals that are being nominated for a second or third 3-year term to the Board of Directors. I won't name them all off. They can also be found on page 13 in your annual report. If I could have a motion to accept this slate of individuals? Thank you. A second? All in favor? Opposed? Thank you, and we're extremely grateful to all of you for your continued support of the Research Bureau. Please join me in a round of applause to thank all those who contribute.
Thank you, Sandy. I'd also like to thank Sandy for her outstanding 2 years of leadership as the board chair, her current leadership on the nomination committee, and membership on the executive committee. And also, Sandy and the DCU Center, thank you for letting us host this event here and your generosity. I now have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Roberta Schaefer. President of the Research Bureau. Anyone who has had the opportunity to work with Roberta on a one-on-one basis or see her speak about Worcester's property tax rate at a city council meeting or present one of the Bureau's research reports understands the passion and persistence Roberta brings to her role as president of the Research Bureau. During this past year, Roberta, with the help of the staff, have sponsored forums or research papers on many relevant topics. Here are the titles of just a few. EPA stormwater regulations in Worcester. Will ratepayers be drained? Healthcare reform. Is it healing Massachusetts and the nation? Balancing the fiscal year 13 budget. Has the crisis passed? The insight and research provided by these reports and forums is helpful to both business and municipal organizations. In 2011, Roberta, together with the Long Range Planning Committee of the Research Bureau, concluded a multi-year effort that resulted in a strategic collaboration with Assumption College that will benefit both organizations for years to come. Roberta has been the steady guiding hand of the Research Bureau for most of its existence, and we are extremely fortunate to have her as president, and I am pleased to introduce her now.
Thank you very much, Mike, for your very generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. And permit me to reiterate Mike's welcome and to thank you all for joining us for the Research Bureau's 27th annual meeting. And I also want to echo Mike's thanks to all of our sponsors and our board members and our executive committee members, all of whom volunteer countless hours to ensure the Bureau's success. And I also want to thank the many corporations and local foundations and individuals who have supported and continue to support the Research Bureau, even during these most challenging times. The banners around the room were already mentioned, but let me say again that this room, these banners represent all the sponsors of this event. And I think the only place where you'll see more banners is Fenway Park. But I'd like to think that the Research Bureau's record for educating the public and informing public debate on public policies is better than 500. The confidence our sponsors and supporters have expressed in the Research Bureau's work has provided the encouragement and the sustenance for us to continue, and my heartfelt thanks to all of you. One of those individuals who devoted considerable time over 2 decades to the Research Bureau and had a substantial impact in shaping its direction was Agnes Cull. And I'd like to take a moment to remember our former executive committee member, treasurer, and board chairman, whose sudden death nearly a year ago left a deep hole not only in the lives of her immediate family and co-workers, but in the lives of her extended family at the Research Bureau. As you will see from our tribute to Agnes in our annual report, she was a very special friend to the Research Bureau and to me personally. We were most fortunate to have had Agnes's steady gaze reviewing and monitoring the Bureau's finances. We want to thank her daughters, Tara and Karen, and her grandchildren, Sabrina and Ross, who are here today for sharing Agnes with us during all those years. Our heartfelt sympathy to them and to her extended family at Greenberg, Rosenblatt, Cull, and Mazzoli, many of whom are also here today. Would you folks please stand and be recognized? Thank you. I would also like to express the Bureau's gratitude to the staff at Greenberg for continuing to serve as watchdogs of the Bureau's finances and fiscal health, especially Maria Crowley, Shelley Truitt, and Kevin Rookie. Thank you to them. Our annual report provides you with a synopsis of the year's events. There are 2 items that I'd like to highlight. Mike mentioned our collaboration with Assumption College. Thus far, we have established an internship program that will begin this fall. We have organized and jointly sponsored 2 programs related to timely public policy topics that were well attended by faculty and students, and we have jointly submitted a proposal to a foundation that would enable the introduction of some courses related to public policy and provide permanent funding for lecturers and internships. We're very excited and pleased about the opportunities that this collaboration presents and that will benefit the college, the Research Bureau, and most important, the community at large. The second item I'd like to highlight is a perennial favorite, Worcester's tax rate. After recommending the adoption of a single tax rate for more than a decade, the Research Bureau's position, it seems, is finally gaining some traction. And the recent increases in the assessed values of commercial and industrial property offers that opportunity. There is general recognition by the counselors that establishing a dual tax rate 28 years ago was one huge mistake. However good its original intention, the effect over almost 3 decades has been to pit homeowners against business owners, divide the community, and to leave Worcester at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis neighboring communities in attracting businesses. There have been endless stories of businesses not even considering Worcester because of the high commercial industrial tax rate. The newspaper accounts after last week's hearing made it sound as though close to a majority of the counselors are now favoring a single tax rate. However, one proposal that I've read about to phase it in over 10 years is simply not acceptable. Such a time frame is meaningless, especially when it relates to political issues. Most of the office holders making such a commitment today probably will not be there in 10 years to see it to fruition, and no business person would take such a promise seriously. Not even the former Soviet Union developed 10-year plans. While the Research Bureau suggested phasing in a single tax rate over 3 years, up to a 5-year phase-in would be acceptable. The time is right, folks. Please talk to city councilors and encourage them to develop a 3 to 5 year plan for phasing in a single tax rate. We should use the city manager's 5-point financial plan as a model for the city council to adopt a set of principles it can adhere to that will get us to a single tax rate sooner rather than later. The quality of our research, which has been a hallmark of the Bureau since its founding, and its accessibility in terms of the clarity with which the reports are written and their availability to the public free of charge on our website, thanks to our many benefactors, depends on having an able staff. And I wish to commend the Bureau's team for its exemplary work. Stephen Ide, who's the Senior Research Associate responsible for public policy reports, and Jean D'Aso, Director of all our programs and operations. Thank you to my team. Thank you. I also want to thank Sandy Dunn's staff here at the DCU Center for all the logistical arrangements for today's events, and thanks also to Deborah Penta and her staff at Penta Communications for their generous support of all things graphic and technical. I conclude by thanking Eric Rosengren for joining us today, and I know that you're all anxious to hear about the state of our economy and what he has to say about it. So let me again thank you all for coming, and I'll turn the program back to Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. Before we hear from Eric, our keynote speaker, I'm going to ask Ralph Crowley, President and CEO of Polar Beverages, to introduce Eric. As I mentioned earlier, Polar is the leadership sponsor of today's event. Ralph and Polar have been strong supporters of the Research Bureau, and we thank you for your support. In addition to being President and CEO of Polar, Ralph is actively involved in the soft drink industry on a national basis and is the former president of the American Beverage Association, and today serves as its treasurer on the executive committee. Ralph also sits on the board of the Mass Food Association and on several corporate and nonprofit boards, as well as a big Worcester supporter. For the past several years, Ralph has served as the chairman of the New England Advisory Council of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, working with Eric. So who better to introduce Eric than Ralph?
Mike, thank you for those kind words about Polar. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Eric, who I've become friends with over the last, 7 years or so while serving on his council. Eric became the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve of Boston in July 2007, just as the housing bubble burst and shortly before the Lehman Brothers collapse. So what a test of talent right there. Previously, Eric was the executive vice president, head of the bank's department supervising regulation and credit. As a trained economist, he joined the bank in 1985 as a member of the Research Bureau. In his research, Eric has made significant contributions in the field of banking, monetary policy, and he has written extensively on macroeconomics, international banking, bank supervision, and risk management. He has focused his research in financial problems that really affect today's economy for those of us in this room. He holds a BA from Colby College, an MS and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, Madison. His daughter, Erica, just graduated from Colby, so I'm curious as to why we don't have a mule here as opposed to a penguin. And his son attends Villanova. The passion of the family is tennis. It's a great pleasure to introduce Eric.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ralph. I hope everybody can hear me. I like to walk around. I don't like being tethered to a platform. So I'll walk around a bit. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Can everybody in the back hear fine? Wonderful. As was mentioned, Ralph serves on our New England Advisory Council. That's a group that brings businesses from all over New England and meets 3 times a year to give us some feedback on what's going on in the economy. It's one of several different advisory groups that we have. So part of my job is to go out and talk to groups like this and hear what's going on all around New England. And part of it is we bring people in, and Ralph has been wonderful in chairing the New England Advisory Council and providing great support for quite a few years. So I really appreciate all he's done at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. He's been a great contributor. I was last in Worcester giving a talk in May of 2009. It was clearly a much darker period in May of 2009. If you remember back to that time, the economy really we stopped talking about depression about that time. So we were slightly improving, but we had a long way to go. So it's nice to be in an environment where I can have a more positive spin to what's going on in the economy. Brian made his comment that the Research Bureau is a fact-based organization. Well, I view the Federal Reserve as a fact-based organization as well. And so as I go through your slides, you're going to see lots of data. I'm an economist as well as being at the Federal Reserve, so it's an occupational hazard that I love data. There's no statistics, there's no regressions, it's just graphs. But I will be taking you through some data just to get a sense of what's going on in the economy. I'll focus primarily on the domestic economy. There's certainly been a lot of news internationally. I'll take a few questions afterwards if people want to go in that direction. I'd be more than happy to do that at that point. So let me just give you a quick overview. Overall, I'm not expecting particularly strong growth for this year. So the first quarter was only 2.2% GDP growth, and over the entire year, I'm only expecting growth to be 2 to 2.5%. That's pretty moderate growth, but it is positive growth. So we've had 11 consecutive quarters of positive growth. That's certainly good news, but unfortunately, it's been in this range. So it's been growth that's been enough to get some employment growth, but not enough to dramatically bring the unemployment rate down, which still remains very, very elevated at 8.1%. Now, despite that rather moderate growth assumption, it's conditioned on 2 very strong assumptions. One is that Europe is able to muddle through, and obviously we're going through spasms determining whether it looks like they actually will or they actually won't, depending on the news story and depending on the day. But my assumption for that forecast is that we don't have something untoward happen in Europe. And the second is that towards the end of this year, we have what's called a fiscal cliff, or what's been referred to as a fiscal cliff, which is a number of different proposals, some tied to the tax side, some tied to the revenue side, that would result in a very dramatic change in government spending and government taxation that would begin the first of this year. If all those proposals went in as enacted currently, it would be a very, very significant change in fiscal policy. The economy probably couldn't sustain easily that kind of change. So my assumption is that there'll be some kind of compromise, that we get a sustainable fiscal policy, but it's not an on-off switch that occurs starting with the beginning of the year. Growth of 2 to 2.5% implies really very little improvement in labor markets over the course of this year. So if my forecast is right, we'll be seeing an unemployment rate roughly in the range that we currently have it. So let me start with some positive news. And the positive news is that in the household sector, we've been doing a little bit better. So the chart to your left with the blue rectangles is highlighting consumption. Consumption is 70% of the goods and services produced in the economy. So you really care whether the consumer is willing to spend. And you can see from the vertical axis that we've grown from less than 1% in 2011 quarter 2 to the first quarter of this year was 2.9%, much stronger than the 2.2% overall for the economy. So the consumers come back, and that is good news. If the consumer continues to purchase goods and services, that will help sustain the economy going forward. The second element is the residential investment, so that's the housing sector. As everybody's well aware, the housing sector has suffered very severe problems since 2007. One of the areas that our economic forecasts have been off is that residential investment had continually been assumed that in 2 to 3 quarters it was going to improve, and we'd get to 2 or 3 quarters and it would be, again, 2 or 3 quarters in the future, and it really didn't happen. Well, we're finally getting some improvement in residential investment. I think here in New England we're actually seeing it. I am seeing houses selling a little more quickly. It does seem like housing prices may have flattened out, so I think that is a positive sign. And we are actually getting some residential investment. I would highlight, though, that the first quarter was unusually warm, so the seasonals may be a little difficult to interpret, but nonetheless, I do view that we're on a somewhat more positive trend. I would highlight, though, that it's only somewhat more positive. This is a chart that my research associate calls the spaghetti chart. And you don't have to look at any particular line. What I want you to get from this chart is if you look back to 1984, you can see that there's a lot of differences across different regions. Some regions doing very well, some regions not doing so well. As you move across and you look at the most recent period, what's striking is how tightly bunched those lines are. So in all regions of the country, we've been moving relatively in lockstep. So what that implies is that it's national factors, not regional factors, that are dominating the house price movements. And unfortunately, those national factors are things like foreclosures, the fact that many borrowers are underwater, that the amount that they've borrowed for their home is greater than the value of the home. So those kind of factors have been a depressing factor on housing prices. And so to really see a robust housing market, I would start to expect more regional variation than we've seen. So while residential investment has been improving a bit, I would highlight that it's not quite as strong as I would hope, because I'd start expecting to see a little bit more regional variation in the data. Turning to things that have not been as positive, government spending, as everybody knows, there have been cutbacks, particularly for state and local spending. Everybody knows we need to get our deficit situation under control over time, and there have been substantial cutbacks, particularly at the state and local level. But I would highlight that there are substantially more cuts that are likely to be occurring as we get to the end of the year. And I don't know whether that'll be a mix of taxes or government spending cuts, but that will be an area where if government spending is cutting back quite dramatically, you need other sectors of the economy to pick up in order to continue to have the economy growing at a rate that would bring the unemployment rate down. The green rectangles are business fixed investment. Business fixed investment actually was a really positive aspect to the recovery that we've had. If you look at the last 3 recoveries and look at business fixed investment, business fixed investment is actually right on track to where we've been at this stage of the business cycle. But unfortunately, unlike for the households, we're seeing some ebbing of business fixed investment that have occurred over the last 2 quarters. I think that's partly a function of the headlines that we're getting in Europe, partly a function of fiscal policy concerns. But that is a concern. If business fixed investment starts to drop off, then that's not a particularly good sign for the overall economy. Now, I'm about to give you a forecast, and I always give a forecast with a little trepidation. So I wanted to highlight something before I did that. So this is the estimates of real GDP, but it's looking backwards. So when I'm looking backwards, I don't have to make assumptions about monetary policy. I don't have to make assumptions about what Europe's going to do. I don't have to make assumptions about anything. I just have to get a sense of how do we measure the economy right now. So the blue dashed line is the advanced estimate. So if you look at the blue dashed line at the far end, we're at 2.2% for the first quarter of this year. So we're about to get our second estimate, which would be the red triangle. And then once a year in the summer, we get a revised estimate, which is that blue box. Now, if you compare the blue box to where the dashed line is, you can see that it's not unusual that we miss by a full percentage point. Now, this is with no assumptions whatsoever. I don't have to worry about whether Iran gets attacked. I don't have to worry about any of these other factors. If I start trying to forecast the future instead of estimating the past, then my ability to do that becomes a little bit weaker, and as a result, the forecast errors can become very large. So whenever you have an economist giving you a forecast, you should always remember what the error margins are around these forecasts. But given that as a caveat, let me just give you my own forecast. So the FOMC central tendency, each quarter now, the FOMC as a group, all the participants in the FOMC, so the regional presidents, as well as the 7 governors down in Washington, submit their forecast for what they think is going to happen with the economy. And so we provide these 4 bits of information: the unemployment rate, real GDP growth, and inflation, both core and total, using the PCE inflation measure. So the central tendency just throws out the top 3 and the bottom 3 and looks at what the central tendency of the committee is. And you can see that the 2.4 to 2.9%, now this was as of the last FOMC, so it's 3 or 4 weeks old, but nonetheless, you can see that they were expecting pretty moderate growth, but I'm expecting growth slightly weaker than the central tendency. I'm expecting the unemployment rate to stay slightly higher than the central tendency. We're at 8.1%, so I'm expecting at the end of the year, we're roughly going to be at the exact same spot. And in terms of inflation, I'm slightly more optimistic that I think we'll be below 2%, both for PCE and PCE, taking out commodities. Ralph's laughing because we always have this debate at the Fed with Ralph about what's going to be happening to commodity prices and inflation. But I think we've actually seen some fairly substantial declines in oil prices recently. A number of other commodity prices are probably going to help on that total inflation number. And I'll be showing some wages and salary information further in the talk, which is going to highlight that the labor markets being weak has implications for how much we expect the inflation rate to go up. So a brief summary of what I've talked about so far. There are some significant downside risks, so I'm assuming some of those downside risks are not going to materialize. I do think that monetary policy should remain accommodative. We need to have faster growth than 2 to 2.5% if we want to lower the unemployment rate. So that would imply that further accommodation is both appropriate and necessary from the monetary policy side. So one of the issues is, can monetary policy do anything about the unemployment rate? So there's an active debate both within the FOMC and within economists and the public more generally about what's the cause for the unemployment rate being so persistently high. So structural unemployment is a mismatch in the skills. So the idea there is if you're an unemployed construction worker and we need lots of nurses, that it's not going to be very easy to convert construction workers to nurses. And so if that's the predominant reason for why we have very high unemployment rates, then we're not going to be able to do much with monetary policy. We can move monetary policy, but it's not going to train that construction worker to be a nurse. That's really something that fiscal policy would have to be focused on. Now, I would highlight that structural unemployment occurs in every recession and recovery. And there's always a mix of jobs. The economy is constantly churning depending on where the growth rates are. So during construction booms, we need more construction workers. If the medical field's doing very well, we're going to need more nurses and doctors. So it's not unusual to always have some level of structural unemployment. But around times of cyclical change, we sometimes think that that structural unemployment rate becomes much more important because winners and losers in terms of industries become much more apparent as you're coming out of a recession. Alternatively, it could be more of a cyclical problem. So the idea of the cyclical problem is that primarily it's that demand in the economy hasn't been all that strong. So as I've said, during this recovery period, the economy's only been growing roughly in the 2 to 2.5% range. That's really not fast enough growth to make major headway to bring the unemployment rate down. We'd need faster growth than that. So the other side of the argument would be that it's primarily that we just haven't had enough growth. If we had more growth, we'd get the unemployment rate down more quickly, and that despite some of the structural unemployment problems, that the bulk of the problem is tied to more inadequate demand. So I want to talk a little bit about these two differences with some data. So it's going to be a bunch of spaghetti charts, I'm afraid, but I think you'll get the general view from this. So this shows the employment growth by census region. So one way that you might expect to have structural unemployment, if some industries are doing really, really well and other industries aren't. So for example, if in North Dakota we need lots of people to work on the oil rigs for all the shale oil, North Dakota is going to grow very rapidly, and if we no longer need people building houses in Miami, Miami's going to have a lot of unemployed construction workers, and you might expect to see some very large regional variations in the employment patterns. So if you thought structural unemployment was a real driver, you might expect that you'd see a lot of variations across different parts of the country. And you can see that going back to the 80s, there was a lot of variation across different regions of the country. You can see actually that New England stood out during the recession that we had in the late 80s and early 90s. And you can see different other regions of the country that are either at the top or at the bottom at different stages during the last 25 years. But what's striking is that to the far right, we're not seeing that much regional difference right now. So we're seeing employment growth, but it's roughly similar across all regions of the country. Well, it's not only pretty similar and pretty bunched, but it's not very rapid. So if I was expecting a structural unemployment story, I'd expect some regions of the country to be doing a lot better than others, and that we would be talking about the problem if we need getting people to move from one area of the country to another to match those jobs. But that doesn't seem to be the primary problem. Second, if you look at the different regions of the country and ask, are there some regions? So the other was employment growth. So that's, if you're looking at it from the firm side, how many people are there hiring? This is looking at it from the labor market side and saying how many people are unemployed in a particular region. So it's looking at the unemployment rate by census region. The blue line is December of 2007. That was right before we went into the very severe recession. The red is April of 2012, which is the most recent data that we have. So what you can see is the difference between the red and the blue rectangles. In every region of the country, we're nowhere close to the unemployment rate that we were prior to the start of this recession. So that if you had a structural unemployment story, you'd expect some regions of the country would start getting an unemployment rate that would be around the low 5%. We do have some states like that, but we don't have many regions like that. And in fact, you can see that most regions of the country are well above 6%. So if you look at the long-range expectation of the people that are on the FOMC, they think in the long run we're going to be in that 5 to 6% range. There are very few regions of the country that are that close to that 5 to 6% range right now. This looks at the employment from the change from the peak employment rate. So there are 4 different recession recovery periods. The blue line is the recession that occurred starting at the end of 2007. And the 0, that middle, is just the very bottom, the employment trough. And what this is trying to get at is, how long does it take you to get back to where you were prior to the onset of the recession? And so you can see that the previous 3 recessions had substantially less of an employment effect than this one. That's why people are calling it the Great Recession. There was a much more substantial effect on labor markets than we saw on the previous ones. Now, you can also see that in 2001 and in 1990, people talked about it being a jobless recovery. Well, what they were referring to is that there was a pretty flat recovery. It took a long time before we got back to the same employment level that we had prior to the onset of that recession. So you can see that in both of those, it took a little bit less than 2 years. But 2 years out from the trough of this recession, where are we? We're still substantially below where we were at the outset when the recession actually occurred. It really shows you how far we have to go to get the labor markets to where we were before. That is dramatically different. So you can see that there has been some recovery, there has been some improvement, but we're far from where we want to be. So that means that we need to get more growth if we want to get back to zero anytime soon. Now, there have been certain sectors that have been disproportionately affected. Two of the ones that I'm highlighting here are construction and government. So if you looked at the employment report and you compare public and private employment, you would know that state and local government have been cutting workers for quite a bit over the last few quarters. And as we all know, construction industry was hit much harder than other industries in this recession as well. So the dotted line just looks at it excluding construction and government. But even taking those two industries out, you can see that we still remain dramatically below where we were prior to the onset of this recession. So it's not just due to one or two industries disproportionately accounting for the kind of unemployment. It really is much broader than that. And that's also illustrated in the employment growth by industry. So one of the things you'd expect if it was structural was that there would be certain industries that would have very rapid growth and that they'd start hitting bottlenecks. With those bottlenecks, they wouldn't be able to find the workers that they need. And you can see that there have been periods where there have been quite a bit of variation among the industries. In particular, if you look at that 5% line, there are periods where certain industries, including construction, have grown very, very rapidly at certain periods of either recessions or recoveries. But if you look to the far right, you see that, again, it's actually fairly tightly bunched. What's not striking about this recovery is that there are certain industries that are growing extremely rapidly. What's striking about this recovery is how modest all industries have done, rather than the fact that some industries have done really well and some industries have done really poorly. So the fact that those are much more bunched than during other periods would be an indicator that it's really not a structural story. It really is a demand story, that otherwise we'd be seeing more dispersion across some of the businesses. Finally, in terms of the structural story, if I really thought it was a structural story, when certain industries have trouble finding people, they raise the wage. So you'd expect to see that if there was a real structural story in some industries, we'd start seeing wages going up much more rapidly than in other industries. This shows you what's been happening across the various industries. Again, what's striking is no industry stands out for having very rapid wage increases. That's because labor demand's been pretty weak across most industries. And so we're not seeing much wage pressures in the overall economy, but we're also not seeing very much wage pressures according to different employment categories. So in conclusion, unemployment remains uncomfortably high. My forecast for inflation is that inflation is going to remain below 2%. The Federal Reserve has set a target of having inflation at 2% in the longer run. We're right around that point right now, both with the total and core. There's significant downside risks. Europe and fiscal policy are the two that I've emphasized in this talk. And it highlights that if we want to really improve demand, the main game in town still remains monetary policy. Should we have the downside risks materialize, that would argue for actually much more aggressive monetary policy. Hopefully that won't happen. It's not that I'm expecting it, but if that were to happen, that would be the appropriate policy. So I've gone through a lot of data, and I'd be welcome any kind of questions that you have. If you could just speak up so everybody else can hear. So the question was on healthcare spending, and that we are seeing some improvements in the cost structure of health, and do I have any reasons for why that's occurring? I think there's a lot of focus on healthcare spending. It has been growing much more rapidly than other types of spending, and a lot of it is financed by the government. It is an area that if we want to get government spending under control, it's really important to get our healthcare costs under control. If you talk to the major hospitals and the administrators at major hospitals, they're going through significant structural change in the models that they're using. I think they are becoming much more efficient. They are thinking much more in terms, in the Boston hospitals, you hear much more about capitation, that they have a fixed price per person that they're insuring, and then they try to have more preventive care, and they definitely don't get rewarded for doing more procedures than are necessary. So I think there have been some structural changes that are going in healthcare. That being said, we still have very expensive healthcare, and that's an area that is going to continue to have to get a quite amount of attention. Other questions? Please.
When you use the words accommodating and stimulant in terms of fiscal policy, what specific strategies are you referring to?
So the accommodative was referring to monetary policy. But for fiscal policy, an accommodative fiscal policy would be more government spending or lower tax rates. And a contractionary fiscal policy would be doing the exact opposite, cutting government spending or raising taxes.
Let me say it's easier said than done.
Excuse me?
I said it's easier said than done.
I don't think there's much disagreement that in the longer run, we do have to have a sustainable fiscal policy. I think one of the lessons we're learning from Europe is if you do it too abruptly, it can have a broader impact on the economy. So we're seeing very high unemployment rates and unemployment rates going up in Europe. So it has to be done sensibly. We want to get on a sustainable path. No one's in disagreement about that. I think it's really what is the pattern of that fiscal policy and what is the constellation of taxes and government spending that both get us back to full employment, but also get us on a more sustainable level for government spending. Please.
Would you lay out a worst case and a best case scenario for your economic situation and just maybe a bullet impact to us here in the U.S.?
So the question was, could I lay out a worst case and a best case scenario for Europe? I'm not going to be very specific about a worst case scenario, but I would say the kind of experience that we had in 2008 with the Lehman Brothers failure, one of the problems when you have a large failure of either a large financial institution, a large company, or potentially a sovereign debt problem in a particular country, is that there's some unexpected effects. So in 2008, one of those unexpected effects was that some money market funds had substantial holdings in Lehman Brothers. That resulted in a disruption to our short-term credit markets that I think was largely unanticipated. So the risk, I think, in Europe is that there are going to be some people with exposures that we're not that aware of right now, that we would not have thought would necessarily have had those exposures, that end up being overexposed to a potential problem. And that has unforeseen consequences that affects not only Europe, but could potentially affect us through our financial markets. So in the same way that when Lehman Brothers in the fall of 2008 was primarily a domestic issue in the United States, it had a global ramification. Countries in Asia that didn't have any subprime mortgages nonetheless got dramatically impacted by what happened. So if we really had a disorganized failure in Europe, it would be hard to fully insulate our economy. Now, that being said, there are things that we can do. Our banks are much better capitalized than they were in 2007 and going into the crisis. Some of the worst financial structures that were around, like the structured investment vehicles, the SIVs and other things, most of those have disappeared as a result of having the severe recession. So I think we're better positioned than we were. But nonetheless, there's just some unforeseen consequences that we have to be worried about. I think the good outcome actually is not as good as you might want either, which is more of a muddled through. So it's somewhat of enlightened self-interest, gets them to do a set of policies that will end up being a very, very slow recovery, making our recovery actually look relatively strong. The unemployment rates in some of the peripheral countries are really quite striking. There are several European countries with unemployment rates in excess of 20%. And they're looking at negative GDP growth possibly for the next couple of years. So even a good outcome, which is that they kind of managed to muddle through, but they nonetheless have some severe competitive issues that they have to address. And they definitely have fiscal problems that they have to address, and particularly the peripheral countries. That implies a pretty slow growth for many parts of Europe for quite some time. So the good outcome is probably only very modest growth, and the bad outcome would be much worse than that.
Good outcome would significantly impact where we are in our trajectory.
So the good outcome, so my forecast is kind of the good outcome, which is that Europe muddles through and that we don't have really spillover effects that are meaningful in the United States. That being said, so I mentioned business fixed investment. One reason a business might not want to do a lot of investment is they may be a little concerned about what the outlook is for Europe and whether some decisions will result in there being spillovers. Until some of that gets resolved, some businesses may be less willing to make the investments that they otherwise would make. So I would say that some of that uncertainty affects us now, and that already is a spillover. So one of the reasons we have not as strong growth going forward through the rest of this year is we do have this risk that Europe could evolve into something we're not expecting. And that's certainly not my expectation for a bad outcome, but it is a risk. Yeah. Why don't you wait for the mic? I'm having a little trouble hearing.
Hi. You mentioned that in 2012, the first quarter was the consumer spending was grown by 2.9%. In your opinion, what would you say has contributed to that consumer spending growth?
So there are a number of factors. One is that the unemployment rate has been coming down. And so when the unemployment rate comes down, it gives people more spending money to be able to go out and consume. There's been a lot of deferred consumption. So one of the areas that's improved is auto sales. Starting in 2007, 2008, a lot of people put off auto sales. Auto sales have improved fairly dramatically over the last couple of quarters. So that is a strong sector. Until fairly recently, the stock market had been doing quite well, so there are wealth effects to when people decide to make consumption. And also, if housing prices start to stabilize, you may be a little more confident and more willing to go out and spend. So I think all those factors played somewhat of a role in why we're seeing stronger consumption. I would say, though, that even for consumption, the seasonal pattern and the weather patterns matter. We had a very warm first quarter, so it really has a big impact on residential investment. It probably had some effect on consumption as well. If you build a new house and buy a new house, you probably buy a refrigerator and a dishwasher and all the things that go with that house as well. So some of it may be seasonal patterns, and we'll get a better sense of that over time. But I think some of it is a little bit more underlying strength in the economy as well. Last question.
What would you consider as additions to the monetary policy that we've already undertaken?
The question was, if we were going to do more monetary policy accommodation, what would be the options? So we have Operation Twist right now, which is that we're trying to flatten the yield curve, which is bring long rates down. That program ends at the end of June. So one possibility is that you would extend that program to try to keep long rates down for a longer period of time. A second option would be to purchase more assets and expand the Federal Reserve balance sheet. That could be done with either Treasury securities or it could be with mortgage-backed securities. So it would be trying to bring down the spread of mortgage-backed securities relative to Treasury securities to continue to try to encourage the housing to pick up. It could be to be more specific about our language about when we would start tightening or how much that's tied to a forecast and how much of that is more of a promise that we won't do anything on the short end of the market. So we could change our language around what we do to imply that we'll be longer before we would start tightening up policy. That has an impact on interest rates. The last couple of times that we've used communication strategies, the rates have actually come down fairly significantly. So any one of those would be possible ways to try to have more accommodative monetary policy. All right, very last question.
Speak a little bit about your longer-term forecast on inflation, because it seems to me that a lot of the stimulus and liquidity that's in the market right now has to have an impact. And not that all inflation is bad from an asset standpoint, but what are your thoughts on that on a longer-term forecast?
So I think people heard, but the question was, in the longer term, what was my assumption about what was going to be happening to inflation? So the Federal Reserve's been fairly clear that they want an inflation target of 2%. I fully expect over a number of years that is where we're going to end up. Right now, I'm expecting that I actually will undershoot that. That's partly tied to some more favorable news that we've had more recently on oil prices and some commodity prices. But it's also tied to the labor markets remain quite weak. So as the labor markets start to improve, as we get closer to full employment, you wouldn't want the kind of monetary policy and fiscal policy that we have right now. You'd want a tighter policy. And we'll have to see whether it's fiscal policy or monetary policy that does most of the initial tightening. But I would expect that as you get an economy that's more normalized, you get an interest rate environment that's more normalized, and you'd get a deficit situation that's more normalized as well. So hopefully we get a trajectory that tightens policy appropriately, both on the monetary and fiscal side, so that we're able to maintain an inflation rate using the PCE inflation rate at roughly 2%. I actually think that we have a reasonable shot at achieving that. My bigger concern in the short run would be that we are going to undershoot it. If labor markets stay this weak, wages and salaries have not been growing very rapidly, and if events abroad start having a broader impact on the United States, then that would certainly mean that it would be a longer period before we'd get a more normalized inflation rate. But the Federal Reserve is committed to having a 2% inflation rate, and I would expect averaged over time, that's exactly what we'll see. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Excellent presentation. Just before we wrap up, a couple things. I want to thank everybody here today for attending the meeting and all your ongoing support. Please visit our website for upcoming events and research reports. There's always a lot going on, so urge you to take the time to attend one of our upcoming events. And join us for a reception afterwards. And with that, I will ask for a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Aye. All right, thank you very much.